We never talk about nuclear matters by chance, especially when President Emmanuel Macron mentions European nuclear deterrence, or rather the sharing of French nuclear deterrence with the rest of the European Union, or particularly with Germany. On paper, we can consider that this is the answer to a strategic environment where the guarantee of American protection is increasingly uncertain, and where powers, for example Russia, but not only Russia, now take a much tougher stance in their relationship with the European continent. Already in March 2025, Emmanuel Macron announced his intention to open a debate on extending the protection offered by the French arsenal to other European partners, effectively breaking with the tradition of strict nationalization of French nuclear deterrence. In February 2026 at the Munich conference, he even mentions a holistic approach to deterrence, which would be supported, I quote, by common security interests among the members. The German Chancellor, Merz, even went so far as to confirm confidential discussions about a possible European nuclear component, explicitly complementary to NATO and certainly led by France. But behind these statements there is a central question. Should France Europeanize its deterrence without giving up its ultimate lever of sovereignty? The first confusion to clear up concerns nuclear sharing within NATO. Nuclear sharing simply refers to the stationing of American weapons, notably B-61 bombs in several European countries, Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, with active participation from these states, mainly through their air delivery systems, in this nuclear sharing, all under the political and operational control, of course, of Washington. Germany, for example, hosts around 20 B-61 bombs and plans to integrate them into its future F-35s while still remaining legally non-nuclear under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The United States justifies this, according to a NATO interpretation, by stating that as long as control remains exclusively American in peacetime, the stationing of American nuclear weapons is not considered a transfer. Under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the French president's version currently has nothing to do with a physical transfer of French warheads to Germany, which would go against both the French doctrine, the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Germany's commitments. For example, the 2+4 treaty signed in 1990 during the reunification of Germany confirmed Germany's permanent renunciation of nuclear weapons, and it excluded any deployment of nuclear weapons in the former German Democratic Republic while preserving the pre-existing NATO framework in the former Federal Republic of Germany. The Franco-German nuclear division is therefore based on three aspects: Franco-German strategic consultation on the potential use of the nuclear force, political recognition that French deterrence protects vital European interests, and German financial participation in the cost of the nuclear deterrent force. If the idea does not conflict with the treaties, then a whole range of questions arise: strategic, operational, defining vital interests, defining a cost scale, defining. The French approach relies entirely on the possible emergence of European strategic autonomy, and although the trend is toward transatlantic volatility, we are still far from it. The risk, then, is to dilute French credibility without obtaining a clear commitment from Berlin. It wouldn't be the first time, because French deterrence was born from a Gaullist reflex of independence. After World War II, Paris refused to depend entirely on Washington for the country's survival, and decided to develop its own nuclear force. It became operational in the 1960s, then in 1966 was accompanied by the withdrawal from NATO's integrated command. This force is designed as the ultimate guarantee of national sovereignty, neither negotiable nor shareable. The sanctification of French nuclear independence would persist through all changes of government throughout the Fifth Republic. Neither Giscard d'Estaing nor François Mitterrand would open the way to sharing. No matter the speeches about European solidarity, the doctrine remains clear. The strike force protects France's vital interests. In Germany, nuclear power faces a triple taboo: the past of the Third Reich, the devastation of 1945, and the East-West division, which lead to a political culture deeply distrustful of any militaristic stance. The reunification of Germany in 1990 marked the renunciation of the possession, mastery, and control of nuclear weapons. Germany accepts the existing NATO nuclear sharing arrangement, but categorically refuses any national nuclear weapons. Attempts at Franco-German strategic convergence, even since the Cold War, have consistently stumbled over the issues of sovereignty and strategic culture. Emmanuel Macron therefore claims to overcome this legacy by anchoring it in a much broader European narrative. Because Macron's initiative is taking place in a deeply deteriorated environment. On the eastern flank, the war in Ukraine has turned into a prolonged conflict. At the same time, the American political trajectory is fueling doubt. What if Europeans had to at least consider a plan B when it comes to ultimate security? That's what the French president thinks in any case. He says that Europe must redefine its security architecture and develop its own parameters, which includes a common approach to French nuclear deterrence. The difficult goal, then, is to reconcile the French doctrine with common interests, accepting that deterrence can no longer be considered a strictly national matter if we want to make Europe as a power credible. But which Europe are we talking about? We always come back to the same old issues, with each European country seeing the European Union through its own historical, geographical, and economic lens. The Central and Eastern European states, especially Poland and the Baltic countries, are very attached to the American umbrella, and they are historically wary of French or German leadership. The neutral states, whether legally or politically, like Austria and Ireland, are also not very inclined to participate.
Paix à toute architecture nucléaire européenne.
What about public opinion in Germany and France? The former do not necessarily want to give up the post-90s principles, while the latter remain attached to what could be one of the last tangible elements, in 2026, of French sovereignty. What about the American reaction as well? With its nuclear sharing, the United States maintains leverage on the continent, which remains critical within the broader American strategy, mainly in the context of its economic war with China and for selling its goods and hydrocarbons. On top of that, there's the cost of. The French nuclear deterrent represents about 6.4 billion euros per year. In a tight budgetary context where Paris is looking for financial partners to maintain and modernize its nuclear capability without weakening its conventional forces. Hence the interest in a German contribution, which raises another question. Is this truly a European security project, or rather a French solution in France as a last resort to a problem of resources and finances? Let's now realistically weigh the pros and cons, starting with the pros. First of all, there's the idea of strengthening a European power in an increasingly hostile environment, whether it's facing Russia but also America, and the ambitions of other powers. Also, consolidating the founding core of the European Union, France and Germany, as the pillar of European defense, and by involving Berlin in the doctrine, the cost, and the political legitimacy of nuclear deterrence. Finally, optimizing existing resources through funding, and even the potential use of German delivery systems as part of the deterrence architecture, which would statistically become more effective and therefore more credible, even if control of the warheads would remain French. On the other hand, there is the risk of diluting French sovereignty. Any consultation structure de facto opens the way to a German political veto, which undermines the independence of decisions that was so important to the French doctrine since de Gaulle. There is also the German ambiguity. Merz insists on the NATO framework, respect for German law, and refuses any differentiated security zones in Europe. This currently reflects more of a polite and nuanced rejection than a real commitment to share the French nuclear burden. There is also the risk of transatlantic tensions. Washington could see a European deterrent structured around France as the beginning of strategic competition, with the retaliatory measures that implies, mainly legal and economic, which could follow. There is also opposition within the European Union, especially from Eastern European countries, which have so far always favored American leadership in their interests, rather than German or French. And the powers that are content to mind their own business and already maintain the American umbrella by taking on the indirect costs, such as infrastructure or compatible delivery systems, for example. And finally, there is the worsening of tensions with Russia, all without addressing the insufficiency of European conventional means, which nuclear deterrence does not solve. Ultimately, as you can see, the advantages for now are mainly symbolic and political, a signal of autonomy, the strengthening of the Franco-German partnership, whereas the risks are institutional, with the loss of freedom of action, strategic, with American or Russian reactions, and domestic, with German acceptability, or the European opposition on the table, its most valuable asset. Germany gains extra security but without offering an equivalent commitment in return. From the point of view of motivations now, we need to distinguish between two levels. On the geopolitical level, Emmanuel Macron is trying to position France as the pivot of European security. By offering an extended umbrella, he is trying to turn an asset, perhaps the last national asset, into a lever for European leadership. On the domestic level, the initiative comes in a context of political fragility and just 1 year before the end of his term. A European deterrence project therefore makes it possible to project oneself onto the international stage, giving a strategic veneer to a contested presidency. But the gamble is also risky. Any opposition to the project in Europe will automatically backfire against Paris. There are also many structural limitations. There is the absence of a treaty equivalent to Article 5 of NATO to formalize a European nuclear guarantee, the impossibility for Germany to commit to nuclear sharing without a profound revision of its legal commitments, and the risk of creating a two-speed deterrence Europe, where some states benefit from enhanced assurance with France, while others within NATO would remain dependent on the American umbrella. Lastly, one more strategic question remains open for debate. President Emmanuel Macron is clearly trying to force the issue by taking advantage of the context, where the war in Ukraine and Trump's term might eventually push Berlin or other powers to accept the idea of sharing French deterrence. Isn't he then trying to use the nuclear issue as a bargaining tool to rebalance the French-German partnership and put France at an advantage? But again, the main parties involved, that is, the Europeans, are also wary. The idea might look good on paper, but only if it weren't so shaky and risky.